Blessings, beloveds. Anastasia, Cosmic Astrologer. Welcome back to my channel, and thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you to any new people who are tuning into this video. Okay, so today I'm going to speak to the yod enthusiasts. There seems to be quite a few people interested in aspect patterns, and particularly the yod seems to be quite a popular one. Now, the yod is not necessarily a common or typical configuration, not as common as other aspects. So it is quite a unique aspect pattern. And just to recap, the yod formation or aspect pattern is also known as the finger of God or the finger of fate. It is characterized heavily and described very much by a Pluto energy, which is why it's called a fated aspect. Its configuration usually involves at least 3 planets, and sometimes there can be more planets because there can be 2 planets on this side, 2 planets on this side, all 4 are sextiling each other. That's the first part of the yod, that's the base. And then forming what we call a quincunx or inconjunct, which is 150 degrees, would be a 3rd planet, which there could be 2 planets up there as well, forming a quincunx to the 2 bottom planets sextiling each other. You'll see this very clearly in a moment when I demonstrate my chart example. And I have a really interesting, not only interesting, but a very, very powerful chart example today, and it is Whitney Houston. Now, the reason this particular example, in my view, is probably one of the most powerful ones I've found thus far is because in traditional view of a yod, it is said that the 3rd planet, which is at the top of the yod formation, so you've got, planets down here, and then you've got a 3rd planet on the top. That 3rd planet, which is termed as the apex planet, in Bill Teeny's view, and he's, in my opinion, he's quite an expert on aspect analysis. So I've read his book quite a few times, and I often refer back to it and go to it, when I'm working with people's charts and so forth. Anyway, he states that a true yod is a true yod when you have Pluto as the apex planet. Now, I'm not saying that yods that don't have Pluto at the apex don't act like a yod. They still can. It would come down to really assessing the individual chart to get a sense and an understanding of how this yod configuration would be playing out for any given individual. Point being, though, that according to Bill Teeny, and he's an expert on aspect analysis, it is Pluto that really defines a true yod. And in the case of Whitney Houston, which you will see in a moment when I bring up her chart, she happens to be one of those people that has Pluto as the apex planet. So I'm very excited to share this information with you today and to just point to the yod in her chart and just make some key points about how this yod described her life. In addition to that, I watched a documentary just recently, which is what also inspired me to do this video. And as I've said before, when you're learning astrology, it doesn't matter whether you've been studying for a year or 50 years. The best way to deepen your knowledge and to understand by observation and correlation how the astrology is working, because there's so many different manifestations that are possible with the energies in the chart, whether it's aspect patterns or whether it's in an individual planet in a particular sign in a particular house. Everyone's chart will manifest very, very differently based on their evolutionary path, period. So one of the best ways to learn is to constantly be observing people's charts and drawing the correlations depending on, what you're looking for, what you're looking at, etc. So I'm always looking at people's charts. Obviously, I'm working with charts on a daily basis. That's pretty much what I do 24/7. Well, not 24/7 because I do sleep. But I'm frequently looking at famous people's charts when I can get a fair bit of information about their life story as well. And I will, like, for example, when I watched the Whitney Houston documentary just recently, I sat there, I watched the documentary, I had her chart up on my computer screen, and I was watching the documentary and looking at her chart, and I was seeing her chart come to life through what I was seeing in the documentary. So that's a very powerful way to learn. Just a tip for you. Okay, so as I said, a true yod, by definition, is a yod that has Pluto at the apex point. The other interesting and exciting element of today's discussion is going to be that Whitney Houston actually has what's called a boomerang. Now, I've had a few people email me of late inquiring about a boomerang and reading for that and so on and so forth. So this is very exciting to bring this to you guys because it's a very powerful example of how a boomerang yod aspect played out in Whitney Houston's life. And it's very, very clear. It's not obscure, in my opinion. So I'm going to make some solid key points of what I interpret and identify through her chart and this particular aspect configuration she has. So before I do, just a couple of points. Actually, it might be helpful to bring up her chart because then I can just point to things as I discuss them with you guys. So here's Whitney Houston's chart. I'll just move myself up here in the corner. This is not a rectified time in terms of I have not rectified this chart. The source of this information has come through astro.com. So her time of birth might need to be rectified, but I suspect it's probably very close to this time. And regardless of the time being out by 20 minutes, 10 minutes, 5 minutes, whatever the case may be, this yod boomerang aspect pattern is still there. So having said that, her birthday is 9th of August 1963, 8:55 p.m. in Newark. Sorry, I can't pronounce American states. New Jersey. Newark, I think you pronounce it. Okay. So as you can see, she had, I'm not going to unpack the entire chart, by the way, so let's just be clear on that. Today's focus is the yod and the fact that she has a boomerang yod as well. Anyway, she had Pisces rising, Chiron very close to the ascendant. Now, let's get straight into it. So the yod, for those of you that are familiar, you've probably already spotted it, but for those of you that are not, I will make it very clear. So if you look down here where I'm hovering my cursor, you see Jupiter in Aries at 19 degrees, the moon at 17 degrees of Aries, Chiron's at 13 degrees of Pisces, and Saturn is at 19 degrees of Aquarius. So Saturn to the moon and Jupiter forms a sextile, right? That's the basis of the yod. That's the planets sextiling each other. In Whitney Houston's case, she has both moon and Jupiter sextiling Saturn, so she has two planets at the bottom of this yod as well, which adds a lot more energy into the configuration and into the manifestation of what this all meant for her. Now, as you can see, Pluto is in the 7th house, which even Pluto alone in the 7th house is says a lot about her life. Even if she didn't have this yod, that Pluto in the 7th house is incredibly powerful in terms of what it describes about her personal relationships and her business relationships, which I'm going to speak about in a moment. So Pluto at 11 degrees of Virgo forms a quincunx or inconjunct to the moon Jupiter in Aries, and it forms a quincunx or inconjunct. Those two words mean the same thing, okay, to Saturn. So Pluto, as you can see, is at the apex point of this yod, okay? So that's what a yod configuration looks like. So directly opposite Pluto, you can see she has Chiron in Pisces. This is what essentially creates the boomerang aspect, okay? So Chiron is heavily configured in this aspect pattern as it forms the part that describes the boomerang. And therefore it makes Chiron very, very prominent, but Chiron is very prominent anyway because it's conjunct her ascendant. But because it's in this aspect pattern, it makes Chiron a really powerful key player in terms of what she experienced in her life and how that played out for her. And I'll give you some thoughts around that based on the documentary that I watched. So before I unpack that aspect pattern, I just would like to point out as well that she was a Leo, and the Leo is conjunct, the sun is conjunct Venus in Leo, and that conjunction in Leo in the 6th house is really her craft, you know, her creativity, her talent, really, essentially. There's a lot more we can say to that, but I won't for this video. I just want to point out, though, that the sun in Leo is very crucial in this example of Whitney Houston because the sun in Leo almost always points to one very strong theme that seems to always come up for people is the relationship with their father. It seems to be a very, very powerful and prominent relationship, for better or for worse. It is very typical that people with the sun in Leo either feel a great sense of disappointment with the relationship they have with their father, or they hold their father up on a very high pedestal. The father is everything to them. It's very, very, you've got to understand the myth of Leo and really integrate that into your understanding when you're looking at a chart with the sun in Leo. Just the myth itself says so much about the person and their life and the journey. It's the hero's journey, right? Sun in Leo. And the hero is always projected onto the father, you see. So the father becomes this larger-than-life figure for the person. So the person is usually really seeking so deeply the affection and love and approval of their father, and their life is very much revolved around that particular theme. That indeed was the case for Whitney Houston. She said that she was close to both her parents. They were both heavily involved in her career path, by the way. But she felt a very deepest heartfelt connection was actually with her father, and that's the sun in Leo, the heart. Leo rules the heart. There's many interesting points I want to make about that a little bit later. Just another point I want to make. Her favorite saying was, can I be me? That was her favorite saying that she used to frequently say. This was documented in the documentary that I watched. Now, can I be me is a classic expression of Leo. Leo just wants to be themselves. They want to express themselves. And that was her favorite saying. So I think that's kind of cute and very apt for a sun in Leo individual. Now, her mother, just to unpack a little bit more before I go into the yod, if you can see here, she's got the Jupiter-Moon conjunction in Aries, and that describes her mother, okay? Now, the Jupiter and Moon actually forms a trine to the top part of her chart, her MC, which is her career path, looking at it from a very basic level. So that's part of the success that we can identify, because Jupiter actually rules her midheaven, her 10th house, as she has Sagittarius up there on the 10th house and Jupiter in Aries down here. So there's a very close trine. It's literally 1 degree apart. So that's a very strong trine she has. And the moon as well, trining her MC, also describes the connection that her mother had in her career. Now, Whitney Houston started off as a gospel singer in church meetings. Her mother was a very strong religious figure in Whitney Houston's life. And Whitney Houston's mother was also singing in the church choir and things of that nature. So Whitney pretty much grew up in that kind of environment. So her roots of her musicality are very deeply connected to soul gospel music. That's how she started out. And when she became a popular artist, it was the record companies that pretty much tried to transform her into this pop artist because she was a Black African-American woman. And that was there was still a lot of issues around Black artists around that time. So they wanted to transform and change her image to suit their record sales, which is generally what record companies do. They basically want the person to sell their soul to them so that they can do whatever they want with it. Now that's very interesting because, see, the 7th house, which is where this fated Pluto is, and it's part of the Yod aspect pattern. The 7th house describes her personal relationships, but it also describes her business relationships, okay? Because the 7th house connects to marriage, relationships and partners, but it also connects to the relationships we form on a business level as well. So commitments and agreements and business deals and things of that nature, you always look to the 7th house to get some answers for that. So she had Pluto in there, and quite frequently when somebody has Pluto in the 7th house, the issue of power and control, manipulation, abuse and so forth comes up very strongly in the person's life. And that's obviously in personal relationships, and it can manifest in business relationships as well. And it did in the case of Whitney, even just from the example I gave from the record companies, and I've just rounded it up, summarized it, but that was her life journey. So we can't really understand what that was like unless we've had that experience ourselves, but we can get a glimpse or get a taste of what that might have felt like, perhaps. That's Pluto in the 7th, so that's people trying to control her life. And see, her mother, who, going back to the Jupiter moon, her mother, who was a strongly religious figure in her life. Now, Jupiter rules religion, right? So you see that moon Jupiter, that's the religious fanatical mother that she had. That's classic moon Jupiter interpretation. And there it is, so literal. The Saturn in the 12th, as part of this Yod configuration, is very interesting because Saturn always rules karma and what we need to, really work through in any given life, depending on where Saturn is. So when Saturn's in the 12th house, there's a lot of different things I could say to that. But one thing I will say is this, that Saturn in the 12th house can frequently feel for the individual that their life is out of their control, okay? Especially when Saturn's in the 12th house. So that in itself is a very complex placement for Saturn. We're talking about Saturn energy, which is reality, right? Getting your life structured, ordered, organized, being able to feel like you have a sense of control over your material world and physical world, and you put it in the 12th house and it's swimming in the ocean. It's all over the shop. It's very difficult to grasp, to anchor that Saturnian energy. So it can generally bring up a lot of anxiety for people. So Saturn in the 12th house is classic for anxiety, depression, very deep fears that don't make any rational or logical sense. So that describes part of what was going on with that Yod configuration. The Pluto in the 7th describes the incredibly intense relationships Whitney Houston had. Now, the two primary relationships she had, other than with her parents, who were heavily instrumental in the development of her career, mainly her mother, though, in terms of hands-on in the forefront. The father was more in the background, but the father had just as much sort of power over her, mainly because Whitney had such a soft spot in her heart for him. And it's very interesting and sad, actually, what happened at the end. So this Pluto was this incredible sense of struggle for her. It was her fate, though, because that Pluto is at the apex point of this yod. And Pluto in the 7th house is the fated power struggles and intense relationships. And ultimately, what that could have led to was her own evolution, which it did on certain levels. We don't know how her soul evolved through that. We can't ask her soul, so we don't know. But we're just making some comments around what this could possibly mean and connecting it to at least what I saw in the documentary. So the other interesting part, which I haven't done any work on, but perhaps I will at some stage, would be to see when that Pluto was triggered in her life and correlate it back to the events, okay? Because yods normally lie fairly dormant in the person's consciousness and therefore their life. And at certain junctures in life, through transits and progressions, when the apex planet particularly, even the other planets, even Saturn, Moon and Jupiter, they too will trigger off, activate this yod in the person's life. But certainly when that Pluto is triggered, that's going to be the primary fork in the road, as they call it. A yod always symbolizes a fork in the road, and that means, the soul is faced with this huge decision that they need to make about which direction to take, and that can often be very perplexing, very confusing, very difficult, very challenging, brings up a lot of fear, uncertainty, insecurity, and so forth, generally speaking. So I'd be very interested to do perhaps a second part to this video and check out transits and regressions to Whitney Houston's chart with regards to seeing the yod activated. So the Pluto in the 7th house describes there was a woman that Whitney Houston was very, very, very close to. It was actually her manager. Her name was Robin, a Black African American woman. And Whitney and Robin were the best of friends. They were so close. Robin played a very nurturing figure in Whitney's life. She was very caring and very attentive towards Whitney in all her professional career life, right to the end. And there were a lot of allegations that Whitney was having a lesbian relationship with Robin, because there was a lot of assumption that Robin was a lesbian woman, right? Big deal, right? But they made such a big deal of this at the time. So that's very interesting to me, just stepping outside of the yod for a moment. You see that Uranus? Now, that Uranus is conjunct the descendant. It's on the 6th house side, so it's on the lower part of the horizon, but it could still be affecting her 7th house as well. And that Uranus conjunct the descendant can describe a person having unusual relationships, or unusual connections, or where a lot of assumptions are projected onto the individual about the nature of their sexuality, because Uranus is always connected to unusual, unconventional ways of being, right? So you put Uranus there conjunct the 7th house, that's the world of relationships, right? So that's kind of interesting as well. And Robin did say in the documentary that, and I say this because Whitney had a Mercury-Uranus conjunction, which to me is a freaking amazing conjunction to have with Mercury. It's super powerful for intuition and consciousness expansion and just having very unique ideas and stuff like that. But Robin said that Whitney had a really weird way of thinking about things, really outside of the box and just very unusual, very weird thoughts. That's what Robin said, exactly in those words. So there's that Mercury-Uranus conjunction. Now, going back to the Pluto describing Robin, the reason this Pluto describes Robin is because Robin, while she was a very caring and attentive and nurturing figure in Whitney's life, she also played a very key power figure in Whitney Houston's life. She really helped Whitney control her life, as it were, her professional life, and you could say personal matters as well. Now, Whitney Houston had addiction issues, and she had them from quite a young age. She was, according to the documentary, she was smoking pot from when she was a teenager. That was part and parcel. And she was introduced to it by her siblings, actually. So she started that very, very young, which developed some kind of dependency in terms of her being able to perhaps express herself, feel comfortable, relaxed, perhaps reduce the inner anxieties she felt. Remember, Saturn in the 12th house brings up a lot of anxiety in people. So as that went on, the pot sort of turned into heavier substance usage. And eventually Whitney Houston met Bobby Brown, which I'm sure most of you are aware if you know anything about her life. Bobby Brown is a Black African-American male artist who's still around this day and has moved on with his life and remarried and has children, etc. He was heavily figured in the documentary as well. And the dilemma was this, that Whitney Houston was, she loved Robin so much, her manager, who was her best friend as well. And she loved Bobby Brown a great deal as well, very deeply actually. And there was this immense power struggle between Robin and between Bobby Brown for the whole time that Whitney was alive, since Bobby came into her life. So this went on for years and years. They absolutely hated each other, Robin and Bobby, in terms of what's been reflected through the documentary. So there's Pluto acting in a way where she was completely torn by two people she loved so dearly, and there was this, she always felt that she had to choose one or the other. So there was this immense struggle, pain and anger and all sorts of stuff came up out of that Pluto in the 7th, describing Robin and Bobby Brown. Now, Bobby Brown was the more darker shade of that Pluto because he was he had such a power over Whitney, so much so that he would still be, he was known as a womanizer. He used to flirt right in front of her face at parties that they went to. He would be going up to women and younger women and, just flirting and dancing all over them right in front of Whitney. This was shown in the documentary. So it's not something that's been fabricated. It's there. You can see it. So he was this figure that really dominated and manipulated Whitney quite a lot. Now, they both had drug addictions, and I just can't quite remember which way it was, but one of them had was a severe alcoholic, and the other one had severe addiction to cocaine and ice and things of that nature. And so when the both of them got together, what happened was the substance usage just got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So they were off their heads a lot of the time. And that naturally created a lot of the problems they had in their marriage, their relationship. They also had a daughter together. Sadly, she lost her life, took her own life not long after Whitney Houston. So this Pluto really, it's such a fated Pluto. She was so fated to encounter the relationship with Robin, the relationship with Bobby, okay? That's the apex planet of the Yod in her chart, in her 7th house. So that's pretty clear. Now, getting to the boomerang part with the Chiron opposition, right? Chiron is opposite Pluto. This is very interesting to me. Let me just read you a couple of things. Bill Tierney says the reaction point is Chiron, okay? That's what we're talking about. Directly opposite the apex planet is very, very sensitive. It pinpoints that focused area where the individual's new orientation will center itself for better or for worse. The passing of transits or natal progressions over this reaction degree should be noted carefully, and particularly so if slower moving planets are involved. The higher octave planets, meaning Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, which already are motivated to be self-transformative, should be keenly observed. Sometimes a natal planet will be found at this reaction point in opposition to the apex planet. Until the Yod is fully activated, this reaction planet can create imbalance, vacillation, and contrasting conflicts for the individual regarding his ability to direct the apex planet. So he's saying there that this Chiron really holds such a key component to balancing this whole Yod configuration out. And if the person can't get this boomerang part of the aspect pattern happening, then it's very difficult to get control of this Yod aspect pattern. It's very difficult anyway because Pluto's in the 7th house, and any planet in the 7th house is projected onto the other person. So to get control over planetary energies in the 7th house, the person really has to have done so much inner work. It takes so much inner work, so much consciousness and awareness and awakening to be able to take control over the 7th house planets and integrate them into the self, so much so that there's no longer a need to project them and meet those energies in the other person. The reason they're projected onto another is because that's the only way the person can initially experience those energies, through the other person. That's why the 7th house is so freaking powerful when you've got planets in there. So unfortunately, Whitney did not gain control over that Pluto because that Pluto controlled her life through Robin and through Bobby Brown, and it actually led to her death in the end. I just want to say a little bit about this Chiron, because there are some people that have this configuration. As I said, I've had people email me just recently. To me, this Chiron is quite fascinating. I don't consider Chiron to be any less powerful because it's a planetoid, which just means it's smaller than a normal planet. Chiron's energy and vibration is very, very powerful on so many different streams. I've done a couple of videos on Chiron, so watch those if you want to understand more about Chiron. But Chiron in this configuration is very powerful for these reasons. It was said in the documentary that Whitney Houston suffered very, very badly from low self-esteem and low self-worth. Now that's, to me, that's Chiron in the 1st house, okay? Chiron in the 1st house can be very much the experience, embodying that Chiron energy. Now, obviously at a higher stream, higher level of consciousness, a soul that's vibrating quite high, that's very aware, that Chiron can certainly lead to becoming the absolute healer, right, of one's own body, one's own sense of self, and ultimately a healer for others as well. That's the highest level of it. But in terms of how this was playing out, Chiron in the 1st house is a fear of being rejected, okay, a fear of not being accepted and loved and so forth. So that Chiron describes to her very low sense of self-worth and self-esteem that she had. And if you didn't watch this documentary or you didn't know her, you wouldn't necessarily think that that was an issue for her, because she came across as quite a confident woman, you know. I think what happens to artists, especially when they are in the zone, you know, of their craft, of their artistry, I think the psychological fears that lie dormant in the psyche kind of take a backseat. So the person just infuses that divine artistic expression, and they are the vehicle, right, for that divine expression, in this case in terms of voice and artistry. So, you know, that's perhaps why we could say that on one level, when we saw Whitney perform, you know, she was radiating and shining. I mean, she had one of the most beautiful, most powerful range of vocals. Whether you like her or not, again, doesn't really matter. The fact is that she was a true vocalist, very authentic, very soulful. So that Chiron there, as part of the Yod, the Boomerang configuration, describes her own sense of fears around her own fears around rejection, because Chiron is always about the fear of being rejected, all right? Because in the myth of Chiron, he was rejected when he was born by his mother, by the primary figure in a person's life. That's the mother. The mother rejected Chiron. So that Chiron there in the first house speaks very much about the lack of self-confidence, which is the first house, right? First house is Aries. It's about self-confidence and having the ability to feel confident in your skin, in how you look, in who you are and what you're doing. And I've seen that a lot when people have Chiron in the first house. There's almost always something there that the person feels very awkward about themselves. The Pisces element of this story is very fascinating, because it really draws in the fact that Whitney was born into this very, very religious family. When her mother heard the allegations that Whitney Houston was having this lesbian relationship with Robin, she was interviewed by, might have been Oprah Winfrey. I can't recall. It doesn't matter anyway. But when she was interviewed, she was asked, you know, about how does she feel about Whitney Houston and Robin having a relationship, an intimate relationship. And she was so direct, Moon in Aries, that's the mother, direct, about her absolute disgust about it. Basically, she would not accept that in any way, shape or form in this life, ever. She would never accept that Whitney was having a relationship with Robin. So her mother was very, very traditionally religious, right? She came from that school of religious perceptions in terms of Christianity, right? So the Pisces element to me really speaks to the fact that Whitney was very, very torn through religion and her own sense of wanting to be herself. That's the Pisces dilemma, right? Strong Pisces energy can frequently be experienced for a person where they have such a yearning for the divine, such a yearning for spiritual connection and experience, and the conflict between that and being human and all the desires that a human has in terms of sexuality or could be substance usage. And in Whitney's case, that comes in very heavily. So you see, Whitney was torn with the world of religion and what she believed was the right thing to do, and what she felt the dutiful sort of elements in her psyche about what's right and wrong based on her religious beliefs. And the fact that she was heavily involved in drugs and alcohol for so many years, she was torn between the struggle between the religion and the being human and imperfect, right? So that's where the Pisces comes into this, because Pisces is very much connected to drugs and alcohol and any altered state of consciousness, whichever path you take to experience that. And it also connects to addictions, and she had very severe addictions. So she couldn't get that Chiron balanced to get control of that Pluto in the 7th house to activate that Yod in a way where she was going to triumph. In the end, it killed her. Her drug addiction killed her. The power struggles with the Pluto in the 7th house, it was too much for her. And finally, I just want to say the father, the sun in Leo, who she had such a love and fondness for him. In the end, he sued her for millions and millions and millions of dollars, her own father. Talk about sun in Leo, square Neptune and Venus, right? That's the father. And Venus rules her 8th house, money. So, and there's, to just go a bit further, which I won't unpack now, there is a T-square here with Neptune, Sun, Venus, and Saturn. So that Saturn is involved in a Yod, in a Boomerang Yod, and in a T-square. T-squares are super, super important aspect patterns. That Saturn is so, so fated there in the 12th house. Pretty much you could say that she would have felt her whole life was just completely out of her hands and out of her control. That's how she would have experienced that T-square and that Yod, with that Pluto acting as the fate and destiny of her life. Could have gone different ways, but it didn't. In the end, it went, unfortunately, in a tragic way where she overdosed in terms of how she died. Well, that's what's been said. But it's very interesting because at the end of the documentary, one of the women that was speaking frequently throughout this documentary, who was a very close friend of the family and Whitney, so knew Whitney very, very well, she said, even though Whitney died of a drug overdose, she said in truth, what she really died of was a broken heart. That's Leo, sun in Leo, square Neptune. That's the father. The fact that her father, and she said, because there was a part in the documentary where she said she was interviewed about this issue about her father suing her, and she was asked a few questions. And her response was that she didn't care about the money. For her, it was never about the money, but she was just so brokenhearted that her father would pursue a course of that nature against her, his own daughter. And it was her money anyway. It wasn't even his money. So, yeah, pretty tragic story in the end, but extremely just literal, literal in her chart. You can see it all there. So there's more to this, but I think I've made some pretty clear, I hope, for you guys and solid points about how this Yod played out in Whitney Houston's life. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope it's useful for you in understanding more of your own aspect patterns, or Yod, if you have a Yod or a Boomerang aspect. As I said, I can unpack those layers so much deeper and can really tease out a lot more information, but I don't want to make it 3-4 hour video. So I'll leave it there, and hope you guys have a lovely Easter. It's the 18th of April today. It's my birthday tomorrow. By the way, happy birthday to all the Aries people. I forgot to say that in my Aries April update, which was done a couple of weeks ago. Heading into Taurus soon, so that's going to be in a couple of days' time. I'll be doing an update later on as we get closer to the end of the month of April. I think that's all I had to say. Yeah. Okay, so leave your questions and comments below, and please feel free to email me and book a reading if you would like to, whether it's for aspect patterns in your chart or relationship, astrology, career path, soul path, relocation, children's charts, whatever. There's many different styles of readings I do and offer. And see you guys very, very soon. Much love and blessings. Thanks, guys. Bye.